Jason Lloyd lit the match, but fans brought the fire. After his harsh take on SHEDEUR, Sanders circulated, social media erupted, not in agreement, but in defense. Carman stepped in with receipts, highlighting how Sanders' mistakes were being blown out of proportion, while his progress was barely acknowledged. What might have once been brushed off as tough love now reads as calculated dismissal, and the online community wasn't buying it. They saw through the distortion, the cherry-picked stats, the loaded language, the glaring omission of context around the Browns' internal dysfunction. For many, it wasn't just about a quarterback, it was about accountability in media. Carman's takedown wasn't just a rebuttal to Lloyd. It was a rallying cry to stop letting biased narratives go unchecked and start holding journalists to the same standards of fairness they demand from.
If you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed.
Carman didn't just suggest there was media bias against SHEDEUR Sanders. He flat out said it. On live radio. No filters, no hedging, no safe phrasing. He went directly for the jugular, naming Jason Lloyd as someone pushing what he called a distorted, racially tinged narrative against Sanders. It wasn't subtle, and it definitely wasn't polite. It was explosive. Carman argued that what we've been watching unfold in Cleveland media circles isn't just football talk. It's targeted, systemic framing. The kind that happens when criticism crosses from technical critique into character assassination. And when you look at the patterns, the way SHEDEUR's being scrutinized, Carman says it's impossible to ignore the undertones. The center of the firestorm? Jason Lloyd, a veteran Cleveland reporter, a familiar media voice, and now, at least in Carman's eyes, someone driving a biased campaign against a young black quarterback. Lloyd has repeatedly questioned SHEDEUR's leadership, toughness, and locker room presence. But Carman wasn't buying that these were just normal media takes. He called out Lloyd's comments as more than just harsh. He described them as calculated, selective. He said Lloyd was contributing to a public perception that SHEDEUR was a liability to the team, without offering the same scrutiny to other quarterbacks under similar circumstances. And when you step back, that pattern starts looking real familiar. SHEDEUR Sanders hasn't exactly had a quiet debut, but being a high-profile quarterback in Cleveland was never going to be quiet. Still, what makes this different, according to Carman, is how quickly the media turned. One misstep, and suddenly Sanders is being talked about like he's dragging the entire franchise down. There's no grace period, no benefit of the doubt. Just headlines. Carman wasn't the only one to notice. Fans picked up on it too. Why is every incomplete pass a character flaw? Why are leadership questions being thrown around after one locker room leak? SHEDEUR has spoken confidently, handled press conferences with poise, and by all accounts, has tried to keep the focus on football. But none of that seems to be enough. During recent interviews, SHEDEUR stayed composed. He didn't fire back. He didn't name names. But you could read it between the lines. The exhaustion, the frustration, the constant pressure to defend not just his performance, but his presence. Every quote becomes a headline, every word a weapon. And yet, even with that pressure, he's shown leadership. He's stayed focused. Carman pointed to this as part of what makes the criticism so frustrating. It's not just unwarranted. It's completely detached from what's actually happening on the field. And in the locker room, Carman says the reports of unrest are exaggerated, if not flat-out manufactured. Let's not pretend the Browns have been a model of stability. Coaching shifts, front office questions, weird rotations, public infusion. This is not a smooth operation. And yet, somehow, SHEDEUR is being framed as the cause of all the dysfunction. Like he showed up and the wheels fell off. Carman pointed to the broader chaos as context that the media keeps ignoring. He says if anyone else were quarterbacking this exact team, they'd be getting the rookie in a bad system treatment. But instead, SHEDEUR's performance is being dissected with an edge that feels deeply personal. And the context, the part that actually explains some of the growing pains, is being left out. In press conferences, SHEDEUR has made it clear he's aware of the noise. He's heard the criticism. But he's not here to respond to every article or every anonymous source. His focus, he says, is on building chemistry, improving execution, and keeping his team locked in. But when a player has to defend his leadership on a weekly basis, it's not about football anymore. It's about narratives. And this is where Carman drew his line. He said the Cleveland media needs to do better. Period. That means being honest about what's performance-based and what's personal. That means not letting old stereotypes creep into coverage of a young black quarterback. And that means holding other players to the same standard. Jason Lloyd, for his part, hasn't backed down. He's defended his takes as rooted in what he's hearing from within the organization. But Carman isn't letting that slide. He says this anonymous source playbook is tired, especially when it only seems to surface when the subject is SHEDEUR. It's not just what's being said, it's what's not being said. Where's the same energy for organizational mismanagement? Where's the deep dive on coaching decisions? According to Carman, the selective outrage says more than any column ever could. And fans are starting to notice that too. This wasn't just about a disagreement between two media personalities. Carman's commentary hit a nerve because it reflected something bigger, a tension that's been simmering in sports media for years. Who gets the benefit of the doubt? Who gets called a project versus a problem? By naming names and calling out the double standard, Carman broke an unwritten rule. But he also opened the door to a conversation that's long overdue. Because it's not just about SHEDEUR, it's about how stories are told, who gets to tell them, and what's buried between the lines. The Browns' organizational chaos has provided plenty of cover for hot takes. But instead of zooming out, the focus has been locked on SHEDEUR. Fans are watching talented receivers drop passes, defenses miss assignments, coaches abandon game plans, and somehow, the headlines still lead with quarterback criticism. Carman made it clear, this isn't honest analysis. It's scapegoating. It's media manufacturing outrage for clicks, at the expense of a young athlete trying to lead through turbulence. And while SHEDEUR's story is still being written, Carman warned that the media's version might already be scripted, and not in his favor. Still, SHEDEUR hasn't flinched. He's answered the questions. He's taken the blame. He's stayed level. But no one should have to navigate this much noise this early in their career, especially when the criticism is coming from angles that have nothing to do with the game itself. This entire controversy has sparked a louder conversation among fans, players, and even national voices about how media narratives are shaped, who they serve, and who they target. Because if the goal is fairness, this ain't it. If the goal is honest football coverage, it shouldn't feel like a smear campaign. And Carman's voice may have been the loudest, but it echoed what many have already been thinking. The spotlight is still on SHEDEUR Sanders. And now, thanks to Carman, it's also on the people holding the microphone. At one press conference, SHEDEUR was asked point-blank about the rumors of locker room tension. His response? Calm, collected, and firm. "I'm here to play football," he said, shutting down the noise with as much grace as anyone could manage. But the questions kept coming. Reporters circled like sharks, pushing the same narratives week after week. Carman saw this in real time and pointed it out. The questions aren't innocent. They're shaped by assumptions. The kind of assumptions that don't follow every quarterback. The kind that paint black quarterbacks as unstable or hard to lead, not because of anything they did, but because that's how the story has always been told. Jason Lloyd doubled down again in a follow-up piece. He claimed unnamed sources within the organization were concerned about SHEDEUR's attitude and influence. But Carman wasn't having it. He pushed back hard, calling it what it is, lazy journalism hiding behind anonymity. When only one player is catching heat, and that player happens to be the most visible black quarterback the city's had in years, the optics aren't subtle. The phrasing Lloyd uses, aloof, not connecting with veterans, difficult to coach, they're buzzwords. And fans are connecting the dots. Because if this was someone else, the storyline would be about growing pains. With SHEDEUR, it's about being a problem. Let's not pretend this is the most functional organization in the league. The Browns have cycled through coaches, offensive coordinators, and quarterbacks more times than anyone can keep straight. So why is SHEDEUR supposed to be the stable center in the middle of all that? Carman said it best. You can't blame a house fire on the guy who just moved in. The Browns' dysfunction existed long before SHEDEUR arrived, and it'll probably be there long after. But the media spin acts like he walked into a perfect system and dragged it into chaos. It's revisionist history, and it's dangerous when people start believing it. Carman's criticism wasn't just a spicy media moment. It was a wake-up call. He said the local media needed to hold a mirror up to itself, to question who they defend, who they doubt, and why. And that uncomfortable truth is what made his comments go viral. He didn't accuse one person of racism. He challenged the structure, the pattern, the repeat offense of over-scrutinizing black quarterbacks, while letting others ride waves of goodwill. That's what made the moment different. It wasn't about sports talk. It was about responsibility. In his sit-down interviews, SHEDEUR has rarely slipped. He's chosen to lead with maturity, focusing on team progress instead of getting into media beef. But even in these controlled settings, you can see it. He's tired of the double standard. He knows that one wrong answer will become the next big concern. Carman praised that restraint, but he also said it shouldn't be required. Why should SHEDEUR have to constantly perform grace while being attacked under the table? Where's the balance? Why is the burden on him to be better than the system treating him unfairly? SHEDEUR's talent isn't in question. He's shown flashes of elite potential, even under intense pressure. But the headlines don't reflect that. Instead, they zoom in on moments of frustration or sideline emotion, and use those as proof that something's wrong. Carman called that out directly. He said if SHEDEUR were celebrating touchdowns with swagger, the media would call it cocky. If he stays stoic, they say he lacks passion. There's no win, no matter what he does. And that's the trap, where performance becomes secondary to perception. Inside the franchise, it's not just SHEDEUR dealing with media-driven chaos. The entire team has been struggling with external pressure and internal confusion. Missed assignments, busted coverages, and questionable coaching decisions have all been major storylines, except they rarely lead. Instead, it's SHEDEUR's leadership that gets questioned after a loss. Carman highlighted how that imbalance warps public understanding. Fans hear quarterback controversy and assume it starts in the locker room. But Carman says it starts in the media, because that's who decides what the controversy is. Jason Lloyd hasn't responded directly to Carman's accusations, but his tone hasn't changed. And that silence says a lot. When someone challenges your reporting with that level of seriousness, and you don't clarify or address it, people notice. The public is now reading Lloyd's work with different eyes. Tweets that used to get agreement now get ratioed. Comment sections that used to echo his takes now push back hard. Carman's words didn't just stir drama. They shifted the conversation. And that's exactly what he wanted to do. The pushback hasn't all been media on media. Fans have entered the ring, calling out what they see as a clear double standard. Online forums and social media have filled up with side-by-side comparisons, highlighting how quarterbacks with worse stats or more losses are still getting treated like developing stars, while SHEDEUR is treated like a ticking time bomb. It's not just a Cleveland problem. This is a reflection of how American sports media operates. But in this case, it's happening in real time, in one of the most passionate football cities in the country. And thanks to Carman, the gaslighting is finally getting exposed. Carman closed his now viral with a statement that cut through all the noise. If you're going to judge quarterbacks, he said, do it with the same scale. If you're going to talk about leadership, show us who you're letting slide. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was demanding consistency. That's what this all comes down to. If SHEDEUR makes a mistake, critique it. But critique it the same way you'd critique anyone else. Because if you're harsher, more suspicious, or more emotional in your coverage based on who the player is rather than what they did, that's not journalism. That's bias, and it needs to be called out. The media has power. Carman knows it. Lloyd knows it. And now the fans know it too. The question is, what will they do with it? Every time SHEDEUR sits down for an interview, there's a sense that he's walking a tightrope. No matter how clear or thoughtful his answers are, they'll be dissected for what he didn't say. One wrong expression, and suddenly it's SHEDEUR's disconnecting from the team. One strong opinion, and it's SHEDEUR's being immature. Carman pointed to this constant reframing as a symptom of something bigger. Because we've seen other quarterbacks speak with confidence and swagger and get branded as leaders. But when SHEDEUR does it, there's hesitation in the media's tone. The benefit of the doubt evaporates. The scrutiny doubles. Meanwhile, the Browns' front office chaos hasn't slowed down. Organizational leaks, sideline confusion, and post-game finger-pointing have become almost routine. But instead of the media examining the leadership up top, they're zeroing in on the quarterback position like it's the only moving part. Carman's argument was simple. You can't hold SHEDEUR responsible for a culture he didn't create. If anything, he's trying to navigate a locker room that was already fractured. And blaming the newest guy on the roster for systemic issues is not just unfair, it's lazy. Lloyd's continued coverage of SHEDEUR hasn't softened. If anything, it's grown more pointed. Recently, he hinted at growing concerns behind the scenes, again without naming sources, again without context. Carman called this out for what it is, narrative building without accountability. By repeatedly painting SHEDEUR as difficult or distant, Lloyd is crafting an image, not reporting facts. And when that image becomes the lens through which everything else is viewed, it doesn't matter what SHEDEUR actually does. The damage is already done. SHEDEUR has never claimed to be perfect, but he's shown leadership in a storm. He's stepped up in press situations most rookies would have crumbled under. He's taken hits on the field and in the headlines, and he's kept showing up. Carman and others pointed out that this kind of media pressure breaks players, not because they can't handle criticism, but because they're being critiqued for things no one else is. When how you lead becomes more important than how you play, it's not football analysis anymore. It's character policing. Carman didn't flinch when the backlash came. He stood by every word. On his show and in follow-ups, he said the media has a responsibility to ask itself hard questions. Who are we hardest on? Who gets grace? Who gets labeled? And why? He reminded viewers and listeners that bias isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in tone, in framing, in the subtle way stories are told. And if media members won't check themselves, someone else has to. In this case, that someone else was. The next press conference SHEDEUR held felt different. Not because he changed, but because the public conversation had shifted. Fans started questioning the questions. They noticed the tone. And instead of side-eyeing SHEDEUR, they started side-eyeing the reporters. It's a subtle shift, but it's powerful. When fans begin to challenge the narrative instead of accepting it, the media loses control over the spin. Carman's on-air moment cracked something open. And now the questions being asked of the media are louder than the ones being asked of SHEDEUR. Despite this shift, Lloyd hasn't issued a retraction, clarification, or even acknowledgement. And that's what's adding fuel to the fire. Because when someone's coverage is being publicly challenged as biased and racially coded, and they say nothing, it starts to look like confirmation. Carman called it out again. If you've got nothing to hide, he said, say it. Silence in a moment like this is loud. And in media, silence lets a narrative fester. That's why people are demanding accountability, not just for what's said, but for what's left unsaid. In a recent interview clip that went viral, SHEDEUR was asked about how he's handling criticism. He smiled, then said, "You get used to people not wanting you to succeed." It wasn't bitter. It was matter of fact. And it hit hard. That one line captured the essence of the conversation Carman's been pushing. Because when you expect unfairness, you stop being surprised by it. And that's the real tragedy, not just the bad coverage, but the fact that a 20-something athlete already knows what it's like to carry that weight. Amid all this, the Browns' broader struggles continue. Rotating lineups, confused play calls, and losses that can't be pinned on one position. Yet, the media spotlight remains fixated on SHEDEUR. Other quarterbacks around the league are being given time, excuses, even sympathy. Not here. Carman said it plainly. You don't have to like him. But you do have to be fair. That's the line. That's the only standard he's asking for. And right now, Cleveland's media isn't meeting it. Especially not the voices leading the charge with unverified stories and loaded language. In public appearances, SHEDEUR has remained composed. He hasn't clapped back, hasn't posted cryptic tweets, hasn't given the media what they want, an emotional explosion they can spin into a headline. Instead, he's kept it strictly football, strictly professional. But even that gets twisted. His calmness is reframed as detachment. His confidence gets labeled as arrogance. Carman warned that when every behavior is used against you, the goal isn't analysis, it's sabotage. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Carman didn't just stir the pot, he flipped the whole table over. And in doing so, he made something very clear. This wasn't about defending a single player. It was about forcing a reckoning. If you're going to question a quarterback's ability to lead, question the system that keeps changing the rules depending on who's under center. He said what so many fans had been thinking but didn't know how to say. That media narratives don't just influence perception, they become perception. And once the wrong one sticks, it can derail careers. Carman refused to sit quietly while that happened to SHEDEUR. And maybe that's why this hit so hard. Because it exposed the pattern in real time. Jason Lloyd's coverage didn't exist in a vacuum. It was part of a larger playbook, one that's been used on black quarterbacks for decades. The suggestion that they're not quite leaders, that they're too flashy, too emotional, too much of a risk. It's subtle until it's not. It starts as commentary and ends as character assassination. And when Carman named it out loud, it was like the whole city had to stop and look at what had been said, what had been written, and what had gone unchallenged for far too long. This wasn't a feud. It was a flashpoint. SHEDEUR Sanders deserves to be evaluated like any other player. On his stats, on his tape, on his play. Not on rumor. Not on coded language. And definitely not through a lens shaped by bias and lazy storytelling. And if that shook things up, good. You know what to do. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who's been following the Brown saga. And hit that button if you're tired of seeing the same old double standards get passed off as analysis. Let's keep the conversation honest and loud.